The people who look powerless are often the ones holding the truth. The announcement echoed through Gate 42 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport as hundreds of travelers crowded the boarding area beneath bright white lights. Rolling suitcases rattled across the polished floor. Flight information screens flickered overhead. The scent of coffee drifted from a nearby cafe while children laughed and business travelers checked their watches. In the middle of the noise and movement stood Angela Reed, a black woman in her late 30s, one hand resting gently on the wheelchair carrying her elderly mother. Her mother, Evelyn, looked tired after a long morning of travel, but she smiled whenever Angela looked her way. They had been waiting patiently for boarding to begin. Everything seemed normal. Then the atmosphere changed. At the boarding gate stood Cynthia Blake, a white gate supervisor known among employees for running her section with absolute authority. Her uniform was perfectly pressed. Her posture was rigid. She scanned each passenger with the cold efficiency of someone who believed rules mattered more than people. As Angela approached the gate and handed over her boarding pass, Cynthia frowned. She scanned it once, then again. Her expression hardened. "Step aside," she said sharply. Angela blinked. "Is there a problem?" Cynthia did not answer immediately. Instead, she typed rapidly on her keyboard, while several waiting passengers turned their heads toward the counter. The clicking keys sounded unusually loud against the steady hum of the terminal. Angela remained calm. "Ma'am, is something wrong with my reservation?" Cynthia looked up. "You will not be boarding this flight." The words landed heavily. Angela glanced toward her mother, then back at the gate agent. "There must be a mistake." "There is no mistake." Cynthia's voice carried across the waiting area. Nearby conversations began to fade as travelers sensed tension developing. Angela kept her composure. "Could you please explain the issue?" Cynthia folded her arms. "Your reservation has been flagged." "Flagged for what?" Angela asked. "That information is not available." The answer made little sense. Even several passengers exchanged confused looks. Angela took a slow breath. She had spent her entire life solving problems through patience rather than confrontation. "Then perhaps someone else can review it." Cynthia's eyes narrowed. "I already reviewed it." The line behind Angela continued growing. A father holding a toddler shifted uncomfortably. A college student lowered her phone and listened. Evelyn sat quietly in her wheelchair, watching the exchange with concern. Angela noticed her mother's hands trembling slightly from fatigue. "My mother has limited mobility," Angela said calmly. "We have been traveling since 6 this morning. I would appreciate some clarification." For a brief moment, Cynthia looked toward the wheelchair. Then her expression hardened again. "The decision stands." A murmur spread through the waiting area. Several people now openly watched the interaction. Angela could feel dozens of eyes on her, but she refused to raise her voice. Outside the giant windows overlooking the runway, a passenger jet lifted into the afternoon sky. Sunlight flashed across its wings before disappearing into the clouds. Inside the terminal, the tension continued building. Cynthia printed a document and placed it on the counter. "You need to move away from the boarding area." Angela stared at the paper without touching it. Something about the situation felt wrong. Very wrong. Not inconvenient. Not accidental. Deliberate. As the gate area grew quieter and more people began paying attention, Angela looked at her mother, then back at Cynthia. And for the first time that day, a feeling she had not experienced in months settled into her chest. Someone had been expecting her arrival. Angela kept her eyes on Cynthia for several seconds before looking down at the paper resting on the counter. The document contained almost no useful information. No explanation, no detailed reason. Just a notice informing her that her travel status had changed. Around her, the boarding area remained unusually quiet. Travelers who should have been focused on their own flights were now watching the scene unfold. The giant windows overlooking the runway filled the terminal with afternoon light. Aircraft moved slowly in the distance. The ordinary rhythm of the airport continued, but the atmosphere near Gate 42 felt completely different. Evelyn adjusted the blanket resting across her lap and looked up at her daughter. Angela, what is happening? Her voice was calm, but Angela could hear the concern beneath it. She knelt beside the wheelchair and offered a reassuring smile. I am not sure yet, Mom, but we are going to find out. Evelyn nodded. She had always trusted Angela's judgment. Throughout her life, Angela had been the person others depended on during difficult moments. She was not someone who reacted impulsively. She listened. She observed. She waited for facts. That habit had served her well for years. Rising back to her feet, Angela turned toward Cynthia once more. Could I speak with a supervisor? A faint smile appeared on Cynthia's face. I am the supervisor. Several passengers exchanged looks. Angela remained polite. Then perhaps someone above you. Cynthia's fingers tapped the counter. The decision has already been reviewed. The answer immediately caught Angela's attention. Reviewed by whom? That question lingered in her mind. Behind the counter, another gate employee glanced nervously between them before lowering his eyes toward the floor. Angela noticed. Small reactions often revealed more than words. Nearby, a teenage traveler discreetly began recording on her phone. Others followed. The situation was attracting attention. Not because anyone understood what was happening, but because something about it felt wrong. Angela stepped aside from the counter and guided her mother's wheelchair toward a row of seats near the gate. The overhead boarding announcement began for another flight across the terminal. Passengers hurried past carrying backpacks and rolling luggage. A child laughed somewhere behind them. The normal sounds of travel continued. Yet Angela could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. Sitting beside her mother, she opened the airline application on her phone. Everything appeared normal. Her reservation existed. Her payment was valid. Her identification information matched perfectly. There was no obvious reason for what had happened. Then she checked something else. A small detail most passengers would never notice. Her eyes narrowed. A notation had been added to her travel file less than 12 hours earlier. She stared at the timestamp. It had not been there the day before. Someone had accessed her reservation. Someone with administrative privileges. Evelyn noticed the change in her expression. You found something. Angela slowly nodded. Maybe. She did not explain further. Not yet. Across the gate area, Cynthia was speaking quietly with another employee. The conversation stopped the moment Angela looked in their direction. That alone told her plenty. Outside, a departing aircraft climbed into the bright Georgia sky. Inside, Angela looked back at the timestamp on her screen. The modification had been made at 2:17 a.m. from a corporate access terminal. Suddenly, this was no longer about a boarding pass. Someone inside the airline had taken an interest in her long before she arrived at the airport. Angela lowered her phone slowly and looked across the boarding area once again. The timestamp remained on the screen. 2:17 in the morning. Someone with high-level access had entered her reservation long before she arrived at the airport. The discovery confirmed what her instincts had already begun telling her. This situation was not random. It was not a simple customer service error. It had been planned. Around her, the gate area remained unusually attentive. Travelers pretended to focus on laptops, coffee cups, and newspapers, but their eyes continued drifting toward Angela and her mother. Human beings recognized unfairness even when they did not fully understand it. Evelyn adjusted the blanket on her lap and looked toward the giant windows facing the runway. The afternoon sun reflected across the glass, casting long ribbons of light over the polished floor. You are thinking very hard, she said softly. Angela smiled. You always notice. Evelyn returned the smile. That is a mother's job. For a brief moment, the tension eased. Then Angela's phone vibrated again. A new notification appeared. Not from the airline. Not from a travel application. From a secure communication platform she rarely used outside professional matters. Her expression immediately changed. The message contained only 6 words. We detected unusual activity. Call immediately. Angela stared at the screen. The message had come from a trusted contact. someone who never sent unnecessary warnings. Across the gate area, Cynthia was now speaking with a man in a dark suit who had arrived only minutes earlier. The man carried no visible airline identification badge. He listened carefully while Cynthia pointed in Angela's direction. Then he looked toward Angela and quickly looked away. That single reaction told her more than either of them realized. Evelyn noticed it too. "Do you know him?" Angela shook her head. No, but she was no longer certain that he did not know her. Nearby, boarding began for another flight. Passengers lined up as boarding groups were announced over the speaker system. The familiar sounds of travel filled the terminal. Yet Angela felt increasingly disconnected from the ordinary rhythm around her. Something larger was moving beneath the surface. She opened her reservation details again and examined every line carefully. Most travelers would have seen nothing unusual. Angela saw patterns, access logs, administrative codes, internal routing identifiers, details that seemed insignificant until viewed together. Then she noticed something else. Her eyes narrowed. A secondary authorization code had been attached to the file. It originated from corporate headquarters. Not the airport. Not customer service. Corporate headquarters. Angela felt a chill move through her chest. Very few employees possessed that level of access. Even fewer would have reason to monitor a single passenger. She stood slowly and walked several feet away from the seating area. Her phone remained in her hand. She needed privacy to think. Outside, a jet accelerated down the runway and climbed into the bright afternoon sky. The roar of its engines faded into the distance. Angela watched it disappear among the clouds. Then she made a decision. She opened the secure communication application and pressed a contact name she had not needed in months. The line connected almost immediately. Before Angela could say a word, the voice on the other end spoke first. "Angela, do not leave that airport." The calm seriousness in the voice made her heart sink. "What happened?" she asked quietly. A brief silence followed. Then the answer came. "We believe someone inside the airline discovered what you have been investigating." Angela remained still as the words settled over her. The sounds of the airport seemed distant now, buried beneath the weight of a realization she had hoped would never arrive. Through the giant windows, the afternoon sky glowed above the runway as aircraft lifted into the air one after another. Everything looked normal. Everything looked peaceful. Yet somewhere behind the scenes, people were already moving to protect themselves. "How certain are you?" Angela asked quietly. The voice on the secure line answered immediately. "Certain enough that we activated internal monitoring 30 minutes ago." Angela glanced toward Gate 42. Cynthia was still speaking with the unidentified man in the dark suit. Their conversation appeared tense. The man checked his phone repeatedly. Every few moments he looked around the terminal as if searching for someone. "What triggered this?" Angela asked. A brief pause followed. Several corporate systems recorded unusual access attempts overnight. Files connected to your review were searched by unauthorized personnel. Angela felt her pulse quicken. 11 months of work. 11 months of interviews, maintenance records, compliance audits, and confidential reports. She had spent nearly a year quietly assembling pieces of a puzzle that nobody wanted solved. "Do they know how much we found?" she asked. "We do not know." The answer was honest, which made it even more concerning. Angela ended the call and slowly lowered the phone. For a moment she simply stood there, watching sunlight shimmer across the polished floor. Then she returned to her mother. Evelyn looked up immediately. "Something happened." It was not a question. Angela nodded. "Yes." "Are you in danger?" Angela smiled gently. "No, Mom." That much was true. Whatever was happening now was no longer about personal risk. It was about exposure. Across the gate area, several airport employees had gathered near the counter. Their conversations stopped whenever Angela looked in their direction. Travelers continued boarding nearby flights, but the atmosphere around Gate 42 remained strangely frozen. Even people who knew nothing about the situation sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Angela sat beside her mother and opened a secure folder on her phone. Hundreds of pages of notes filled the screen. Maintenance discrepancies, inspection irregularities, missing records, patterns that had seemed insignificant alone but became alarming when connected together. The deeper she had looked, the more resistance she encountered. Requests delayed, documents misplaced, witnesses suddenly unavailable. At the time she believed it was bureaucracy. Now she was no longer sure. Then her phone vibrated again. A new message appeared. This time it came from a different contact. Arrival confirmed. Stand by. Angela stared at the words. Arrival confirmed. Her eyes moved toward the entrance of the concourse. At first she saw nothing unusual. Travelers crossed the terminal carrying backpacks and coffee cups. Flight crews moved toward departing gates. Families gathered around charging stations. Then she noticed them. 3 individuals entering from opposite directions. No uniforms. No visible identification. Business attire. Calm expressions. Purposeful movements. They were not looking at the departure boards. They were not searching for gates. They were heading directly toward Gate 42. Angela immediately understood who they were. Across the counter, Cynthia noticed them too. The confidence that had defined her posture all afternoon vanished almost instantly. The man in the dark suit stopped speaking mid-sentence. For the first time since this began, genuine fear appeared on someone's face. And as the 3 newcomers continued walking through the terminal, Angela realized the situation was about to become much bigger than a boarding dispute. The 3 individuals moved through the terminal with the quiet confidence of people who did not need to announce their authority. They walked past restaurants, departure screens, and crowded waiting areas without hesitation. Their destination was obvious. Gate 42. Travelers began noticing them almost immediately. Conversations softened. Curious eyes followed them across the polished floor. Angela remained seated beside her mother, her expression calm despite the growing tension surrounding the boarding area. Evelyn looked toward the approaching figures and then back at her daughter. "Are those the people you were expecting?" she asked softly. Angela paused for a moment before answering. "I hoped I would not need to see them today." The response seemed to say more than the words themselves. Outside the giant windows, the afternoon sunlight had begun fading toward evening. Long shadows stretched across the runway as aircraft taxied beneath a sky painted with gold and pale blue. Inside the terminal, Cynthia's composure continued to unravel. The confidence she had displayed earlier was gone. She exchanged nervous glances with the unidentified man in the dark suit. Whatever conversation they had been having suddenly seemed far less important than the arrival of the 3 newcomers. One of them, a gray-haired woman carrying a slim leather portfolio, stopped briefly near the departure board and checked her phone. Another reviewed information on a tablet. The third scanned the gate area with practiced attention before focusing directly on Angela. The moment lasted less than a second, but it confirmed everything Angela needed to know. They had come for this situation. Not for a flight delay. Not for customer service. For this. Her phone vibrated once more. A secure message appeared on the screen. "Team on site. Review authorized." Angela read the message twice. Across the gate area, several airline employees were now gathered near the counter. Their voices remained low, but their concern was obvious. Rumors had already begun spreading through the terminal. Questions nobody could answer were moving faster than official information. A young airport employee approached Cynthia and whispered something into her ear. Cynthia's face turned pale. "What do you mean they requested records?" she asked. The employee responded quietly. Cynthia shook her head. "No, that is not possible." Angela heard only fragments, but the reaction itself told her enough. The review had already begun. Faster than anyone expected. The gray-haired woman finally reached the counter and introduced herself. Her credentials were displayed only briefly, yet the effect was immediate. Cynthia stood speechless. The man in the dark suit took a step backward. Nearby travelers exchanged confused looks. Most had no idea who these people were. They only knew something significant was unfolding. Angela remained seated. She felt no satisfaction. No desire to embarrass anyone. Instead, she felt something else. Relief. For nearly a year she had followed records, reports, maintenance logs, and witness statements that pointed toward a troubling pattern. Every lead seemed to end at the same place. Resistance, delays, missing information. Now the barriers were disappearing. The truth was finally reaching daylight. Then a sudden notification appeared on multiple screens inside the terminal. At first it looked routine, just another airline update. But within seconds airport employees began staring at their devices. Some exchanged shocked looks. Others immediately started making calls. Angela noticed the change before anyone said a word. Something important had happened. Very important. The gray-haired investigator looked down at her phone, read a message, and slowly raised her eyes toward Cynthia. The silence that followed felt heavier than any announcement. And in that silence, everyone at Gate 42 realized the situation had just entered an entirely different stage. For the first time since arriving at the airport, Angela allowed herself to stop chasing answers. She sat quietly beside her mother near the giant windows overlooking the runway while the evening light slowly faded across the horizon. Outside, aircraft moved beneath a sky painted in shades of gold and deep blue. Inside, the terminal remained busy, but the noise felt distant now. The tension that had dominated Gate 42 all afternoon had settled into something heavier. Uncertainty, questions, waiting. Evelyn rested a hand gently over Angela's. "You look tired," she said softly. Angela smiled. "I am." Her mother nodded knowingly. "You have been carrying something for a long time." Angela looked through the glass toward the blinking runway lights. 11 months. 11 months of reports, interviews, maintenance records, compliance reviews, and unanswered questions. 11 months of watching small irregularities form larger patterns. Every document had seemed ordinary on its own. Together, they told a story that few people wanted examined. Across the terminal, the investigators remained near the gate. They spoke quietly with airline personnel while reviewing information on tablets and laptops. The gray-haired investigator occasionally glanced toward Angela, but neither woman approached the other. Nothing needed to be said. They both understood what was happening. Nearby travelers continued checking phones and whispering among themselves. Rumors had spread throughout the concourse. Some believed a security issue had occurred. Others suspected a corporate scandal. Very few knew the truth. Angela preferred it that way. Her phone rested silently in her lap. For the first time all day, there were no new alerts, no urgent messages, no requests for information. The process had finally moved beyond her. Now the facts would speak for themselves. A soft announcement echoed through the terminal as another flight began boarding. The familiar sound seemed almost comforting. Normal life continuing despite extraordinary circumstances. Evelyn watched a plane taxi toward the runway. "Do you remember when your father used to bring us here just to watch airplanes?" Angela laughed quietly. "Every summer. You always wanted to know where they were going." Angela nodded. "And he always made up stories." The memory warmed her more than she expected. For a moment, she was not an investigator. Not a passenger caught in a strange situation. Just a daughter sitting beside her mother. Then, across the concourse, several airline employees suddenly looked up from their phones at the same time. One covered his mouth. Another immediately walked away to make a call. The reaction spread almost instantly, like a ripple moving across water. Angela noticed it. So did the investigators. The gray-haired woman checked her device again. This time her expression changed. Not surprise, confirmation. A few seconds later, Angela's own phone vibrated. One message appeared on the secure screen. Preliminary findings confirmed. Emergency action recommended. Angela stared at the words. The evening sunlight reflected against the glass in front of her. Outside, another aircraft lifted gracefully into the darkening sky. Around her, conversations continued. Travelers rolled suitcases toward distant gates. Families gathered near charging stations. Life moved forward. Yet somewhere beyond the airport, beyond Atlanta, Beyond the reach of anyone standing inside the terminal, decisions were being made that would change the future of an entire airline. And as Angela slipped her phone back into her pocket, she realized the longest part of the journey was finally over. The truth had been found. The first sign appeared on a television mounted above a restaurant near the center of the concourse. Most travelers ignored it at first. Airports were filled with scrolling headlines, weather updates, and business news. But within minutes, people began slowing down, then stopping, then gathering beneath the screen. Angela noticed the change immediately. So did the investigators. The gray-haired woman looked toward the television, then checked her phone. Her expression remained calm, but there was something different in her eyes now. Resolution. Across the terminal, airport employees were reacting even faster. Some stared at their devices in disbelief. Others hurried into offices or disappeared behind secure doors. Conversations that had been whispered all afternoon were suddenly happening out loud. Evelyn looked toward the growing crowd. "What are they watching?" she asked. Angela followed the direction of her mother's gaze. A breaking news banner stretched across the television screen. Federal Review expands into major airline investigation. The words were simple. Their impact was enormous. Travelers immediately began searching for more information on their phones. Reporters appeared on the broadcast discussing newly uncovered compliance concerns, missing documentation, and a rapidly expanding review process. Angela listened quietly. Most of what they were reporting had been buried inside confidential files only hours earlier. Now the story belonged to the public. The evening light outside had faded completely. Runway lights stretched into the darkness beyond the windows. Aircraft continued arriving and departing, their navigation lights blinking against the night sky. Inside the terminal, however, everything felt different. The atmosphere had shifted from uncertainty to realization. People were beginning to understand that this was not a routine corporate dispute. Something much larger was unfolding. Angela's phone vibrated. Another secure message appeared. Additional findings confirmed. Executive review initiated. She stared at the words for a moment before locking the screen. Across the gate area, Cynthia stood frozen near the counter. The confidence that had defined her throughout the day was gone. She watched the television coverage with wide eyes. The unidentified man in the dark suit had disappeared entirely. No one seemed to know where he had gone. The investigators continued speaking quietly among themselves. Their work was no longer focused on gathering information. They were verifying conclusions. That distinction mattered. Angela knew exactly what it meant. The facts had survived scrutiny. The evidence had held together. The truth was no longer a theory. Then another alert appeared on the airport televisions. This time passengers gasped audibly. Several airline employees lowered their heads. Others immediately began making calls. The new headline was shorter than the first. Federal authorities recommend emergency operational action. Evelyn looked at Angela. "Is that serious?" Angela exhaled slowly. "Very." The older woman studied her daughter's face. "You knew this might happen." Angela nodded. "I knew it was possible." Nearby travelers were now openly discussing the news. Some worried about future flights. Others wondered how long the investigation had been underway. Most had no idea they were sitting only a few yards away from the woman whose work had helped expose the problem. Angela preferred it that way. She had never wanted recognition. She wanted accountability. Through the glass, another aircraft lifted into the night sky. Its lights grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared into darkness. Angela watched it go. 11 months earlier, she had started asking questions nobody seemed willing to answer. Tonight, those answers were finally arriving. And somewhere far beyond the airport, behind conference room doors and executive offices, people who had spent years believing they were untouchable were discovering that the truth had reached them at last. The announcement arrived just before 9 o'clock. At first, it appeared only on internal devices carried by airport managers and investigators. Then it spread to phones. Then computers. Then television screens mounted throughout the terminal. The reaction was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Employees looked at one another in disbelief. Travelers lifted their heads from laptops and magazines. Across Gate 42, the atmosphere shifted once again, this time from anticipation to certainty. Angela remained seated beside her mother, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Evelyn looked toward the nearest television as a red banner appeared across the bottom of the screen. Federal authorities order emergency suspension pending full review. For several seconds, nobody seemed to move. The words hung in the air like a distant echo. Then the terminal erupted into activity. Phones rang. Managers hurried toward secure offices. Reporters began appearing on television broadcasts. Experts were already discussing the implications of the decision. The investigation that had remained hidden for nearly a year was now the lead story across the country. Evelyn looked back at her daughter. It actually happened. Angela nodded slowly. Yes. Her voice carried no excitement, no celebration, only quiet acceptance. The process had reached its conclusion. Nearby, several airline employees stood frozen near the customer service counter. Some stared at their screens. Others simply looked exhausted. For many of them, this was not personal. They were ordinary workers caught inside a much larger system. Angela understood that better than most people. The gray-haired investigator approached for the first time that evening. She stopped beside Angela and offered a respectful nod. The findings were confirmed faster than expected. Angela glanced toward the television. I saw. The investigator looked around the terminal before speaking again. Your documentation helped connect the final pieces. Angela lowered her eyes briefly. 11 months of interviews. 11 months of reports. 11 months of unanswered questions. She remembered every late night spent reviewing records. Every witness who hesitated before speaking. Every moment someone tried to convince her that the inconsistencies were harmless mistakes. Now the facts were speaking for themselves. Across the concourse, Cynthia stood alone near the gate counter. The authority she had carried all afternoon seemed to have disappeared entirely. She looked smaller somehow, not because her position had changed, but because certainty had left her. For the first time, she walked toward Angela. Several employees watched nervously. The investigators remained silent. Cynthia stopped a few feet away. Her eyes drifted briefly toward Evelyn before returning to Angela. I did not know, she said quietly. Angela studied her face. There was no anger left inside her, only fatigue. No, Angela replied. You did not. Cynthia lowered her eyes. The noise of the airport continued around them. Boarding announcements echoed through distant gates. Suitcases rolled across tile. Aircraft lights blinked outside the windows. Life continued moving forward. Yet the moment felt strangely still. Cynthia took a slow breath. I should have treated you differently. Angela glanced toward her mother, then back at Cynthia. You should have treated everyone differently. The words were not cruel. They were honest. Cynthia nodded slowly. She seemed to understand. Neither woman said anything else. There was nothing left to argue about. Outside, another aircraft disappeared into the night sky. Inside, television screens continued broadcasting updates as the story spread nationwide. And as Angela watched the reflections of runway lights shimmer across the glass, she realized something important. The investigation had never been about winning. It had always been about making sure the truth finally had a place to land. 3 months later, the airport looked almost exactly the same. Travelers hurried through security checkpoints. Departure boards flickered overhead. Rolling suitcases echoed across polished floors. Coffee shops buzzed with conversations about vacations, business meetings, and family visits. To anyone passing through the terminal, it was simply another ordinary day. Yet for Angela Reed, the familiar surroundings carried a different meaning now. She pushed her mother's wheelchair slowly through the concourse beneath the warm afternoon light streaming through the giant windows. Evelyn looked healthier than she had that day at Gate 42. The stress was gone from her face. Her smile came more easily. Every few moments she stopped to admire the aircraft moving across the runway outside. It is good to be back, she said softly. Angela smiled. It is. They continued walking past restaurants, bookstores, and waiting areas filled with travelers. Life had moved forward. The investigation that once dominated national headlines had concluded weeks earlier. New oversight procedures had been introduced. Compliance systems had been redesigned. Independent reviews had become standard practice throughout parts of the industry. Experts continued discussing the reforms, but Angela rarely followed the coverage anymore. Her work was finished. The truth no longer needed her voice, could stand on its own. As they approached a large observation window overlooking the airfield, Evelyn gestured toward a departing aircraft. "Look at that." Angela stopped beside her. Together they watched the jet accelerate down the runway before lifting gracefully into the bright blue sky. Sunlight reflected across its wings before it disappeared into the distance. Neither woman spoke for several moments. The silence felt comfortable, peaceful. Nearby, airport employees moved through the terminal carrying radios and tablets. Travelers gathered near departure gates. Children pressed their hands against the glass to watch airplanes taxi below. Ordinary moments. Ordinary people. The very people Angela had thought about during every hour of the investigation. Not executives. Not headlines. Passengers. Families. Workers. People who trusted systems they could not personally inspect. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Good afternoon." Angela turned and saw Cynthia standing several feet away. Her uniform was the same, but something about her demeanor had changed. The sharp edges were gone. She looked more thoughtful now, more aware. Cynthia glanced toward Evelyn and smiled politely. "It is nice to see you both." Evelyn returned the smile. Angela nodded. "Good afternoon." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Cynthia looked through the window toward the runway. A lot changed after that day. Angela followed her gaze. "Yes." Cynthia exhaled slowly. "I needed to change too." There was no defense in her voice. No excuses. Only honesty. Angela appreciated that. "Most people never admit that," she said. Cynthia nodded once. "I know." The conversation ended there. It did not need to continue. Some lessons were stronger when left undisturbed. Cynthia returned to work. Angela watched her disappear into the flow of the terminal before turning back toward the window. Outside, another aircraft climbed into the afternoon sky. Evelyn reached for her daughter's hand. Angela squeezed it gently. Together they stood in silence, watching sunlight shimmer across the runway. No victory speech, no applause, no celebration, just the steady rhythm of life moving forward. Around them, travelers continued their journeys without knowing the story that had unfolded months earlier in the very same terminal. And that was perfectly fine with Angela. Because the greatest proof that justice had done its work was not found in headlines or investigations. It was found in the quiet confidence that ordinary people could continue traveling beneath a safer sky.